good morning. It's a great pleasure to be in Taipei. And it's also an honor to be at your forum. I'd like to congratulate you on putting together such an extraordinary event at a very important juncture for the world and for Asia. I'd also like to express my appreciation for the cooperation that The Economist has with Commonwealth magazine in producing the World In publication, which I have the honor and the pleasure to edit each year. It's something that one has to do with a certain amount of humility to look into the future, to forecast. You know, J.K. Galbraith said that the only function of economic forecasting was to make astrology look respectable. And so one has to be very humble. Also, I think nothing illustrates better than the tragic events in Haiti in recent days, that it's the unpredictable events that often move the world with great force. Nevertheless, in looking in the future and in putting together thoughts for the year ahead, indeed the decade ahead, one starts with events that you know are going to happen. So, for example, in the year ahead, you know that it's going to be a very busy sporting calendar. There will be a Winter Olympics starting soon in Vancouver. Of course, the World Cup in South Africa in the summer, the biggest event of 2010 with perhaps a cumulative television audience of 30 billion. The Asia Games will be taking place later in the year in Guangzhou. So very busy sporting. We know about the World Expo in Shanghai, 70 million or so visitors expected beginning in the spring. We know it'll be a very big year for counting people. It's the year of the census. The United States will be having its 10-year census in April. China has a census. Many other countries, I think by my calculation, almost a third of the world's population will be counted this year. Of course, there are many elections. An election in my own country, it'll be a busy year for politics. Midterm elections in the United States. Important world summits. Punctuation marks will be the G20 summits, 2 of them in the coming year, one in Canada in the summer, and one in South Korea. And of course, the G20 has become the prime place for global governance. So that's where one begins with looking at the year ahead, and then we stick our neck out a bit further and we start to look at trends. An Italian journalist colleague who's a very good trend spotter thinks that white wine will be particularly important in the year ahead. And I'm sure he didn't know about the milk clam, or he would have mentioned the milk clam as well. We know that there will be a liberalization of domain names in the internet. So you can see that a trend will be a proliferation of domain names, and also names other than in Latin script. So a dot surge is in prospect. Also, another major trend I think that we can look forward to is this scramble for raw materials and competition for scarce resources, in particular water, food and energy. We see the growing interest in the Arctic, for example. So these are other big things that we can identify for the year ahead. But in looking at the collection of the articles that I surveyed as editor of this publication for 2010, 2 things really stood out to me as pervasive themes for 2010. One was China. The fact that in almost any subject you care to mention, China emerged as a key player, more so than perhaps ever before. China has become, along with America, an indispensable nature. And that's true whether you look at the economy, whether you look at diplomacy, for example, over big issues such as nuclear non-proliferation, or whether you look at the environment and the negotiations in Copenhagen. Wherever you look, China is there. And the second big theme that really stood out for me was a tension, if you like, between what you might call the forces of optimism and the forces of pessimism. And I think you've heard some of that in the speeches that you've already heard this morning, that there is a mixed picture, decidedly mixed picture, really in many of the areas that one looks at as being important for the next decade, between a sense that one should be optimistic, that there are forces of progress, and that there are concerns, risks, worries. And it's that really that I wanted to explore with you this morning through, as we sort of go around the world and look at the prospects for 2010. That's why, if we look at the title of my presentation, I've called it half full or half empty. Is the glass half full or half empty? Because really there's a sense that we are at a very delicately balanced stage in the world's development, where things could go well or things could go less well. And this applies really across the board. So let's look first of all at the overall picture of the world economy. I think there is a lot of talk about which letter of the alphabet the economic recovery will resemble. Will it be an L, a U, a V, a W, or some horrible backwards sloping symbol on the keyboard that you don't want to think about? I think what this slide shows is really that it depends so much where you are in the world. It's a very different picture depending on, you see the enormous growth, continued growth of China, much weaker growth in the Eurozone, modest growth in the United States. And I quite like the idea that it's actually not an L-U or V or W, but it's love, L-U-V. Love is all you need, you know. That if you're in Europe, as I live, it's a very slow recovery, perhaps more like an L, something a little bit more vigorous in the United States, more U-like, but still fragile. And very definitely in Asia, and in China in particular, it's a V. So if you take the glass half full view, that broadly optimistic, yes, very definitely a better outlook for the coming year than in 2009. As you heard, growth likely to be between 3 and 4%, perhaps 3.5%, compared with a significant contraction last year. Certainly in certain parts of the world, emerging markets in particular, still very vigorous growth. Government policy is still being extremely supportive. And I think you would also say that despite some of the concerns about protectionism, one thing that has really been remarkable is how the open trading system broadly has survived this crisis. I think it's not obvious that it would have happened to that extent, but it has. You know, there have been glitches over, you know, the President Obama's measures against tires, for example. But broadly, the commitment to open trade has remained, and you just heard about these free trade agreements spreading around the world. Nevertheless, if you take the glass half empty side, it's a very mixed picture. Some parts of the world are going to be struggling. It's a less vigorous growth than we've seen in recent years. perhaps it'll be 2013 or so before we see growth back up to 4% globally. And I think the policy dilemmas, the sort that have just been described for governments, are extremely difficult. As the measures to support and stimulate the global economy have to be wound down, particularly because of the weight of debt that burdens developed countries especially, this poses a great challenge to governments and to central banks when to withdraw, how fast to withdraw without derailing the recovery. And just looking at the risks of protectionism, they haven't gone away, and it is possible that the sort of reaction that didn't happen over the past year happens with a delay. There were great fears when this extreme crisis struck that there would be social unrest in many parts of the world. There were some dire warnings from very senior figures, politicians, heads of international institutions. It hasn't happened, but there could be such social unrest with a delayed reaction. 60 million more people unemployed in this year compared with at the beginning of the economic crisis. That's a huge potential for disruption and for reaction, social reaction. So certainly no cause for complacency. Let's look at China in particular. I love this illustration. It's a Mount Fuji shape, and it shows how China is overtaking Japan to be the #2 economy in the world, even if you count it at market exchange rates. So this is an important crossover point where China becomes the second biggest player in the global economy. But with that, of course, comes some warning that although China is still powering ahead, 9%, perhaps 10% growth expected in the year ahead, Japan, when it reached similar landmark, and when everybody was saying 20 years ago that Japan was going to be soon #1, overtaking America, that turned out to be the zenith of Japanese relative strength against America. From that point onward, it had 2 decades of stagnation. It reached the plateau of 10% of exports, of world exports, something China is also reaching this year. And then it found it very hard to go beyond that, and it started to go backwards. And today, we hear lots of warnings again about China. You know, will the Chinese bubble burst? You hear that it's Dubai times 1,000 or worse, according to one much-quoted statement. Well, is there really a big danger of a Chinese bubble? The Economist this week has a big analysis of this question, and The Economist falls squarely in the glass half full camp of analysis of China. The analysis this week points to all the reasons why China is different from Japan 20 years ago. Many, many differences, but to name just a few, it's a much poorer country still than Japan was then, so it has a much bigger potential for catch-up growth, for productivity gains. It's a much bigger population, a much larger area, so it has a huge, vast appetite for infrastructure. So while there is talk that there has been too much investment in Chinese infrastructure, actually the needs for China to have more infrastructure are simply enormous. So that gives tremendous further potential for China to develop there. If you look at the asset bubbles that are potentially building up in China, one of them is talked about as the stock market bubble. Well, yes, it's true that there was big growth last year in the Chinese stock exchange, but it's still only below its trend level. If you look at house prices, people look at the ratio between average incomes and house prices and conclude that China is much too high and ready for a bubble bursting. But actually, the Chinese property owning is mainly in the 20% of richest urban households, and if you look at the ratios there, it's much less worrisome. And if you look at the bank lending, clearly there has been a lot of bank lending, but that's been one of the main channels of stimulus. You can look at it as akin to part of the sort of stimulus that has been happening in other countries. And it's still manageable if you look at China's overall levels of debt. They look very low compared with many other countries. This isn't to be complacent. Clearly, China has had too much credit. It needs to be very careful. There are certain specific markets, property in Shanghai, Beijing, for example, where it looks very frothy. And there's a social dimension to this too, which is worrying. But with careful management, I think it's quite probable that this won't result in the sort of repeat of the Japanese experience. Now, one thing that I would just highlight is the peak of the demographic dividend, this last point, that if you look long-term, you look at long-term trends in China, this is actually this year where China is at its most advantageous for the ratio between those people in work and those people who are either too young or beyond retirement age. Beyond 2010, this dividend will start, or the dependency ratio, as it's called, will start to rise inexorably. And that poses a longer-term challenge for China to grow increasingly through productivity gains and not just through additions to the labor market. And furthermore, it will mean, if you compare this with India, India has a much more dynamic demographic profile in the years ahead. So after a certain point, other things being equal, India will start to grow faster than China. So it's not it's something that China is going to have to manage. It's not a serious problem for the coming years, but it's an adjustment that China is going to have to make over the coming years. The United States, just to look at a rather unhappy George Washington there. This chart shows US wages, and it's one reason why the United States recovery is so difficult, because wage growth is very, very low in America. Wage is very depressed. So in such a situation, and at a time when American consumers are trying to shed their debt, it's going to be very difficult for the consumer to start to take on more of the dynamism of American growth again. The consumer, until recently, was the great hero of the American economy and indeed of the world economy, driving growth forward, but that has now changed. So we saw the chart that Dr. Tan showed of how America tends to bounce back very quickly from recession, but that recessions that are accompanied with financial crisis take a lot longer. So that's the glass half empty. That suggests that it could be quite a long, hard slog. I think you can be pretty confident that the boom times will be back in the United States, but it won't happen very quickly, that the recovery will perhaps be reasonably vigorous in the first half of this year, but then this problem of who is going to take up the slack from the government, not the heroic American consumer in the short term, that means that maybe there will be a growth hiccup in America towards the end of this year and in 2011. In fact, my colleagues at the Economist Intelligence Unit forecast that growth this year will be 2.5%, but growth next year will only be 1.4%. So there'll be a slowing down before America starts to recover. And I think it means that if you look at the the rates of American investment, which have been lower than in recent years than they were in the early 1990s, it's quite likely that what is sometimes called the new normal for America will be a slower rate of growth over the next decade than in the past decade, something that America and the world has to adjust to. Just to look at Barack Obama for a moment, a busy political year for him, of course, midterm elections. We have, again, this week's Economist has an analysis of Barack Obama, how he's done in his first year, and quite a positive verdict on him, really not bad. But his own glass is also half empty. His opinion poll ratings are down to 50% from 70% where they were when he came into power. Next year is going to be particularly tough as he has to spell out how he's going to tackle this big deficit. And he faces huge foreign policy challenges, not least, of course, in Afghanistan. If we look at Europe, and I'll whiz much faster now around the rest of the world, unemployment is a huge issue for Europe. Unemployment has risen very quickly, and I think it's likely to be quite a jobless recovery, a weak recovery, a mixed picture between different economies in the euro area, particularly those like Britain, Spain, Ireland, which had big property market bubbles and are now struggling. And of course we have the problem of Greece, which is very heavily indebted and may be the next Dubai, facing an issue of a sovereign lender experiencing different difficulties servicing its debt. There's actually going to be, I think, a very interesting comparison over the coming years between Britain and Spain, both facing a very painful adjustment, but Spain is tied to the euro area, cannot adjust its currency, so it has to try to become more competitive and to somehow find jobs. It has close to 20% unemployment without devaluing its currency, whereas Britain is outside the euro area, has a very weak sterling at the moment, and is able to at least use the currency mechanism as part of its economic recovery. Just turning really just very briefly to some other areas, the Middle East, two stories really. The security story, I think the improving situation in Iraq you see there with the rundown of civilian deaths from violence, American troops, combat troops meant to be out by August, but big worries about the nuclear situation, particularly with Iran. So that's going to be one over the coming year that could really destabilize the region and the world. Just worth mentioning that the fastest growing economy in the world is in the Middle East region in 2010. That's Qatar, going to be growing by about a quarter because of its gas facilities coming on stream. So provided the security situation doesn't produce a crisis, there are big opportunities there as well. A word about Africa, of course, I mentioned the World Cup. It's a very big year for Africa. This will throw a spotlight onto the continent, not just South Africa, but the continent as a whole. And of course, it's a particularly important area for raw materials. Chinese investment in Africa Chinese interest in Africa has been extreme and growing. But I think the real issue for Africa is going to be the quality of its governance, not just in the coming year, but over the coming decade. Africa's success will rely particularly on not only on the competition for its own resources, but its own quality of governance. It's a sobering thought that the worst country in the world, as nominated by the world in 2010, is also in Africa. That's Somalia, and we've heard also of problems in other countries such as Yemen in recent days as well. The environment, and I'll move very quickly because time is limited, but it's one of your big themes. I just really want to emphasize that a lot of the stimulus spending has been on green stimulus, and that's particularly the case in Asia. So if you talk about new engines for Asian growth, this has to be one of them. It's an area where I think many economies think that they can be competitive, but I would think that this is an extension of traditional Asian industrial policy extended into the area of green economy. And I think technology is going to be moving faster than governments. We saw a disappointment in Copenhagen. There'll be other attempts, second attempts, third attempts in international gatherings to move that agenda forward. There may be in America a carbon bill in the coming year which will help to move things forward. But in the meantime, a lot of the real action will be at the corporate level, government-led investment nationally. So you'll see a lot of developments in electric cars, in great efficiencies in the use of natural resources through genetically modified crops, for example, huge advances in technology through smart grids and other means that will ensure that raw materials get used. There is much less wastage in the system. And finally, business. Just a word about business is an illustration from an article we had about MBAs and how the MBA was going to be punctured. All these MBAs, of course, were part of the clever people who got us into the mess of the financial crisis in the first place. And whenever I show this, I have lots of very worried MBA students. There are probably some of you in the room saying, well, what does this mean for me? Well, of course, there will be a great future for MBAs. But I think more seriously, there is a problem for business. Reputation of business has taken a knock through this crisis. The financial sector in the first instance, but business more generally. It means that careers in finance, in business, are perhaps a little bit less attractive. Government looks more attractive. That's not necessarily a great thing for the dynamism of the world economy. For businesses generally, I think corporate social responsibility, which you might have thought would have vanished as they just care about survival, actually in a strange way has become more important. Companies have to make more efforts to show that they bring benefits to society. I think that trend will grow. And more generally, I think we're moving from a phase in 2009 when business strategy was just about survival for many companies, where for many more now it's lifting the sights to strategy and to growth, the sorts of questions that this conference is asking in a very timely way. And those answers will increasingly, particularly if you're in the West, be looking at the big emerging markets. They will be saying that this is where the growth is coming from. You need to get closer to these markets. You need to understand these markets better. So, just very briefly in summary, we're at the beginning not just of a new year, but of a new decade. What will characterize that decade? I've tried to show that in almost every issue that you look at, there is a glass half full or a glass half empty way of looking at it. If you look at glass half empty, maybe there'll be the terrible tens. They'll become known as the terrible tens after the naughties that we've just come out of. But if you take the glass half full attitude, they will of course be the triumphant tens. I would suggest that it's likely to be a bit of a mixture, that it will be hard work, a hard slog, but still plenty of opportunities. So I prefer to talk of the tenacious tens, and I wish you all the very best success for the tenacious tens, starting, of course, with the Year of the Tiger. Thank you very much.
谢谢英国经济学人主编 Daniel Franklin。